The 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, or a couple other titles, none of which actually seem to describe the war accurately, as it lasted from 1754 to 1763, and the French and Indian War title makes it sound like the French were fighting the Indians, not the British. At least, there's a good reason why they did not name it the 9 Years' War, as there already was a war named that. Whatever misleading war name is chosen, though, matters little, unlike the war itself, which mattered a lot, since it changed the balance of imperial power across the world from India to North America. This war, which Winston Churchill once called the First World War, primarily involved two common antagonists, the United Kingdom and France. While the broad history and impact of this war continues to fascinate historians, we will focus in on the North American front, where the French and the British fought and enlisted colonists and Indians to their cause. In North America, the impact was great, though, and many events during and resulting from the war led to the American Revolution and War for Independence. Before this point, the colonists and Indians had gotten used to French and British conflict, since this was the fourth war in the last 70 years between the two powers, and each group had adapted. The colonists grew closer to Britain for protection, and the Indians chose sides, or chose not to choose sides. The colonists had begun forming militia, and they were getting better at fighting, as evidenced by a regiment made up of New Englanders capturing the key French fort, Fort Louisbourg, in 1745. Which the British gave back afterwards for some islands in the Caribbean. Needless to say, the colonists weren't all too happy with that. The colonists had continued to grow fearful of both the Indians on their border and the French, who controlled a greater deal of influence with the Indians than they did. It didn't help that the Catholic Jesuits were succeeding in teaching their beliefs to the Indians. Without doubt, that made the Protestant colonists even more fearful, given their general hatred of Catholicism since the whole Henry VIII situation. I'll form my own church with blackjack and divorce. The Great Awakening only increased this fervor as more people became more religious, copying the British lead, as the colonies did at this point. In fact, the leading preacher of the period was a Brit, George Whitefield. The colonists needed Britain's protection from these heathens, their words, not mine, and that gave the colonies a strong bond with Britain. Obviously, the British felt a certain bond with the colonies too. Bonds of wealth, that is, as the colonies were perfect for mercantilism as they produced raw materials, shipped them to Britain, and then bought the finished manufactured goods. The colonies were starting to become more independent with producing goods, and with politics. The Albany Congress of 1754 being the prime example, with calls for greater self-governing and ultimately rejected by the colonial office. The Congress did give us this famous Benjamin Franklin cartoon, though. On the whole, though, the colonists seemed closer than ever to Britain, what with their mimicry on various fronts, and their need for protection as they were almost surrounded by French territory. The colonists may have feared the French and Indians, but it's clear that the Indians were also fearful of the growing expansion of both the British and the French. The Indians were being pressured to pick a side, and most, but not all, did. The one notable exception, the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy decided to remain neutral and used this neutrality to play the two powers off each other as they tried to gain favor with the Iroquois, whose power in some of the disputed territories was significant. The Iroquois established a greater sway over the European imperial nations than any other tribe before them, demonstrating both to those nations then and to us now that they were forces to be reckoned with in this land. However, the Iroquois did not stay neutral through the entire war. Diverging from many of the other tribes who had sided with the friendlier and less encroaching French, the Iroquois sided with the British, and some historians theorize that without Iroquois support, the British may have lost the war. The Iroquois were quite powerful, both in numbers, comparatively to the other Indian tribes, and prowess. So this is not a far-fetched theory. After the British had won, though, Indians, both allies and enemies in the previous war, started feeling the pinch of British expansion. As the colonists expanded into Iroquois territory, and the British solidified their control of the fort in Detroit, at least in the case of Detroit, the response was violent, beginning Pontiac's rebellion. The rebellion met with great early success. By the beginning of July, every British post west of Detroit had fallen to the Indians, and Detroit lay under siege. However, eventually the rebellion was squashed, but the impact was lasting, and it made the British wary of infringing on Indian territory. Pontiac's rebellion also seems to mimic the French side of the war, with early success giving way to harsh defeat in the end. Though it ends there, as France's harsh defeat was nowhere near as harsh as the Indians' harsh defeat. After the Treaty of Paris, no, not the 1783 one, no, not the 1898 one, and not the 1951 one, the 1763 one. There we go. So many treaties of Paris. After the treaty, the French lost all of Canada. They also lost the territory that the British then called the Northwest Territory and Louisiana, which would seem devastating to their colonial empire if they hadn't gotten some very valuable islands in the Caribbean in the treaty. It makes no sense that the French came out on top there. It does mean, however, that the French were gone from impacting the colonies, which removed the greatest threat to the colonies and the greatest tie to Britain. See, with the French gone, the colonies only had to deal with the Indians now, and they had been doing pretty well at dealing with them so far. But what they didn't foresee is that soon they would be dealing with Britain in new ways. The first of these ways came about with another 1763 agreement, the Proclamation Line, which forbade colonists from settling on the other side of the Appalachian mountain range. The colonists duly ignored this because, like a certain lion from a popular movie, they wanted to explore this new area. Though in this case it's forgivable. They didn't have James Earl Jones telling them not to go there. What's your excuse, Simba? Another result from the war was brought on by the huge, unprecedented debt Britain had obtained during the war, approximately £160 million. The British had to try to raise revenue to pay for this enormous debt, and they chose taxes, or more accurately, they chose enforcing taxes and anti-smuggling legislation in the colony. These changes did not go over particularly well in the colonies, and this chipped away confidence in the government and in the desire for the colonies to be close to Britain. Now we hold up for a minute with a warning. While what I'm discussing is designed to point out that the 7 Years' War and its aftermath were critical in the developments that led to the American War of Independence, as historians one must be careful with being too deterministic. Even as disgruntled colonists protested taxes, they did not actively call for revolution. The war for independence was not predetermined, and assuming so brings a teleological approach to these events. The breakup of Britain and the colonies was not inevitable, but it did happen. It's a difficult balancing act when talking about history with the forces at play compared to what occurred. As more and more taxes and acts piled up that were objectionable to the colonies, though, dissent rose, especially in the colony of Massachusetts. Those troublemakers. The behavior of the colonists became worse, with the Boston Tea Party being one of the most notable pre-Revolutionary War events. Maybe if Britain had paid more attention. Also, side note, that comic makes me wish I had a stuffed animal eagle like that. Not too long afterwards, the Intolerable Acts were passed, not to be confused with the Inconceivable Acts or the Unbelievable Acts, which stationed more soldiers in the colonies and severely restricted Bostonians' liberties. The Boston Massacre also added to tensions on both sides as protesters threw snowballs and rocks at the British officers who proceeded to shoot some of them, later on immortalized by Paul Revere. The most important thing he did for the revolution, Mr. Got Himself Captured. The pamphlet of Thomas Paine, Common Sense, also stirred up anti-British sentiment, expanding on the simple phrase, no taxation without representation, and becoming an instant hit in the colonies. As these incidents increased and Paine's pamphlet circulated, the colonies began to band together. But despite this, the colonists weren't yet calling for independence. But they would get there pretty soon. The 7 Years' War altered the balance of power in North America, as the British, with the aid of the Iroquois, succeeded in defeating the French and removing them from their territories, near or in the future U.S. By doing so, though, the British removed the threat of the French from the colonies, which was one powerful force bonding the British and the colonists together through fear and a common enemy. This development most likely would have been ultimately fine, as the colonists had been strengthening their ties to Britain in other ways. economically, politically, socially, and religiously. But the British Empire had accrued a huge debt from the war and decided to use taxes to pay it off, taxes on the colonies. These taxes sparked outrage throughout the colonies, and while initially the British backed off on some of the taxes, when the dissent did not dissipate, the British began cracking down on the most troublesome group. And that is where we leave off, on the verge of the First Continental Congress, Lexington and Concord, and many other important events. I hope you learned something and that you enjoyed this video.